Welcome everyone to week number 6. We are beginning the 6th week of 8 weeks, so we are on the downhill slide right now. Let's see what we've got going on. Okay, so last week we learned about DNA, the molecule itself, how it's replicated, how it's used to make proteins, how mitosis works, which is a type of nuclear division where chromosomes are replicated and then they're split apart so that you end up with daughter cells that are just like the mother cell. We also looked at cancer and how cancer develops and what causes cancer, proto-oncogenes, tumor suppressor genes. And we had really great discussions about that, environmental causes of cancer, environmental risk factors, and how you can change your lifestyle to minimize your cancer risk. So we looked at all of that last week. This week is all about sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction in one of the assignments that you have. So this week you need to take a look at chapters 11, which is on meiosis. That's another type of nuclear division where the chromosomes are replicated, but then the mother cell divides 4 times. There's 2 rounds of cell division, so you get 4 daughter cells, and there's a reduction in the chromosome number. Chapter 12 is all about inheritance patterns, like Mendelian genetics, and if you're doing the lab this week, that's what you will be working on too. You'll be growing those fast plant seeds this week. And then chapter 47, which is way at the end of the textbook, which is about biodiversity. And there's all kinds of biodiversity. There's biodiversity of genes. There's biodiversity in number of species in a community. There's biodiversity really even in ecosystems. So this is just a diverse number of items like genes in a particular species so that you have continuation of that species on into the future. So biodiversity means diversity of some type of living unit, whether it's down on the gene level or organisms or species, etc. Read the Module 6 overview and watch the videos. You're going to need the video on epigenetics when you get to the discussion board posting. So make sure you watch that very interesting video on epigenetics. Okay, so what do you have to do this week? You have 2 things to do, but then you need to work on a 3rd thing also. So you have your discussion board postings, and they will be on the epigenetics video. You're going to take a look at 2 mice that look totally different from each other, and they are identical twins. So you're going to figure out why they are different from each other, even though their genetics is exactly the same. You're also going to discuss nature versus nurture issue. Is it genes that produce you as an organism? Is it your environment that determines what you're like? And I'll talk about more about this in just a second. Your journal entry this week is all about reproduction. So you're going to talk about how bacteria reproduce. You're going to talk about asexual reproduction first. How bacteria reproduce, and I give you a reference here, chapter 22, section 2. If you go there, you will find all the information that you need. So how do they reproduce? By binary fission. That means they just split in half. How do they get new genetic information? Take a look at this in this chapter, because bacteria have to have a way to get new genetic information in order to evolve and to change according to whatever the environmental pressures are. So what do? They mutate. They go through conjugation, they go through transformation, and they go through transduction. These are all different ways that bacteria get new genetic information because they don't sexually reproduce. They have to have other strategies. You're going to discuss what are the benefits or advantages to asexual versus sexual reproduction, and what are the disadvantages to each. And then biodiversity also in terms of evolution. So why is it important to have biodiversity? And several of you have final projects that are on biodiversity, so this should be right up your alley. Why is it important to have biodiversity? We're going to talk about that again in a second too when I show you a different slide. And then also in the journal entry, you're going to talk about the genetic erosion in agriculture. So what is happening to the species of cows that we have on the planet, and varieties even of cows, of corn plants, of banana plants, of chickens, etc. We are losing many different varieties and species and subspecies of agricultural animals and plants because we go into industrial farming where there are huge farming operations and you only want to have one type of cow to make beef, because that just simplifies everything. Well, are we losing varieties? We surely are, and there are statistics about this. How can we keep them? Well, there's a big push, especially in planting gardens and that sort of thing, to resurrect heirloom varieties. And there are places where you can get heirloom seeds. And there are people who have, I don't think you'd say heirloom animals, but they have animals that aren't raised in big industrial farming operations. So you're going to discuss genetic erosion in agriculture. And then finally, you need to work on your slides for your final project. You have 2 weeks to get your final project together. I do not suggest waiting until the next week to work on this. You have to get all of your milestones, all 3 of them, put together in slide format to make your final project. Don't forget to go back and look at all the grading that I've done on these milestones and fix the parts that you need to fix. One section that gives a lot of people trouble is that analysis section from milestone 2. So do take a look at any suggestions that I have given you any time that you lost points, because you want to get as many points as you can on the final project. It is worth 260 points out of 1,000 that you earn in this course. So that is more than a quarter of your grade is based on the final project. So I'm just saying, you really need to put a lot of effort into this. And I'll talk more about it next week. All right, so let's take a look at some of the extra information that I have this week. One important concept this week is that genes equal traits. What is a gene? A gene is a piece of your DNA, or any organism's DNA, that codes for a particular trait. This usually means it codes for a particular protein that's involved in some process in your body or in you as an organism. And so I give you some examples here. The lower left picture shows you a little boy who has albinism. And albinism is a trait where there is a lack of melanin production in the body. That is a recessive trait, and it is in a single gene. Well, actually, there are different types of albinism, but anyway. Good morning, everyone. It is Monday morning of week 6, so let's see what we've got going on. All right, last week you learned all about DNA, the molecule, and how it replicates. You learned about mitosis, which is a type of nuclear division. The nucleus divides, where you have copies made of the chromosomes, and then the 2 daughter cells, their chromosomes look exactly like the mother cell. You also learned about transcription and translation, which are the 2 processes that change the code of DNA into proteins that a cell needs. We also discussed cancer production through proto-oncogenes that turn into oncogenes, tumor suppressor genes that are mutated, and how mutations cause cancer. You also discussed environmental risk factors that raise your risk of developing cancer because you're exposed to certain things. Those have been really good discussions. So this week is all about asexual and sexual reproduction. And let's get into that. So you need to read, or at least skim through, chapter 11, which is about meiosis. Meiosis is a different type of nuclear division where the chromosome number is replicated. But then the cell divides in 2 different rounds of division, and you end up with half the number of chromosomes in each of the daughter cells at the end of meiosis. Why is this important? Because this is important in sexual reproduction, where you take half of the chromosomes from the mother, half of them from the father, put them together, and you get the normal number of chromosomes for that particular species. All right, then we have chapter 12, which is all about inheritance patterns like Mendelian genetics, and that's going to be really important in your lab this week if you are taking the lab. You're growing your fast plants and you're learning how 2 different traits end up in offspring by taking a look at the offspring produced in your crosses in your fast plants. And then also chapter 47, which is all about biodiversity. So biodiversity is just diversity in organisms, but you can have all different types of biodiversity. You can have biodiversity on the gene level. So you have all different alleles, if you learn that from the lab, all different alleles, all different versions of genes in organisms, all the way up to species biodiversity, where you have all different types of species in an ecosystem, etc. So that is very important in the health of species and ecosystems in the world. Read the Module 6 overview and watch the videos on meiosis and epigenetics. You're going to need both of those. You'll need the meiosis for the journal entry and epigenetics for the discussion board postings. So what do you have to do this week? You have discussion board postings and you have a journal entry. And you're going to be working on your slides for your final project. So let's talk about your discussion board postings. This is based on the video that you're supposed to watch on epigenetics, and I'll get into a discussion of this in just a minute. But you will see that there are 2 different looking mice in the video. One is a skinny brown one and one is a chubbier white one, and they are identical twins. So why in the world do they look so different from each other? You will be discussing that in the discussion board posting. And you're going to be talking about nature versus nurture. It's been a discussion for a very long time now. How much of you as an organism is based on your genes, and how much of you is based on environmental stresses that you've been under since you were a zygote, which is a fertilized egg. So that will be a good discussion. Then you have a journal entry. And this one, it has a lot of parts to it. So make sure you write down everything that you need to discuss, because there are a lot of parts to it. How do bacteria reproduce? Okay, I'm sending you to chapter 22, section 2. This will give you everything that you need to know about bacterial reproduction and how bacteria get new traits. So bacteria reproduce through a process called binary fission. That means to split into 2. Binary 2. Fission to split. Okay, they split in 2. They don't do sexual reproduction. So this means that the mother cell produces 2 daughter cells that are exactly like the mother cell. This raises problems for bacteria, because how in the world do they get new genetic information? They have to be able to get new genetic information, or they can't evolve as a species to environmental pressures. Well, how do they do that? Several different ways. Through mutation, conjugation, transformation, and transduction. That's why you need to look at that section in the chapter, because you don't know what those mean. You're going to take a look at asexual versus sexual reproduction and the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those. And there are advantages and disadvantages of each. You're going to discuss biodiversity in terms of evolution. So why is it important to have biodiversity? Why do you need to have different genes in the human population for anything, any trait that there is? This is important. Why? Why is it important? You will also discuss genetic erosion in agriculture. So we have different species of cows and chickens and corn plants and banana plants that we grow throughout the world. We are losing different varieties, subspecies, and even species of these organisms because of industrial farming. Farm operations are just so huge now that we're losing subspecies, varieties, cows, chickens, etc. So is this a problem? Do we cause it? Do we want to keep those different varieties that we have right now that we haven't lost? This leads into a discussion about heirloom varieties. So heirloom varieties are really popular with home gardeners. For example, buying heirloom tomato seeds so that you can grow old-timey kind of tomatoes that taste really good instead of those mealy, tasteless tomatoes that you buy in the grocery store. Why are they mealy and tasteless? Because they survive packaging in boxes and transport over long distances a lot better than heirloom varieties do. So that's why we have those. So you'll discuss that. And also you're going to work on your slides for your final project. So you've got 2 weeks to work on the final project. You have to put together all three of your milestones into a final project. The third milestone you made into slides already. The first 2 milestones, you have to make those into slides. Add graphics, add data, add speaker's notes, not as a separate document, add speaker's notes to the slides. I don't want to have to open 47 different files in order to grade your final project, but I'll talk about that more next week. So work on your slides from your final project. I have made comments on what I've graded so far, the first 2 milestones. I have suggestions for you. Go back and look at those. Look at the graded rubrics. See where I've made suggestions or taken off points because something wasn't there. So go back and fix those. Why is this important? Because the final project counts as 260 points out of 1,000 points that you earned for this class. That is more than 1/4 of the points in this class. So it is a really big, important grade. Okay. All right. Let me talk about a few of our topics this week. Just cover a few. Genes equal traits. So what is a gene? A gene is a portion of DNA that codes for a trait. And that usually means, you've already learned this, a particular protein that's found in a pathway that gives you a particular trait, no matter what species it is that you're talking about. I have 3 different traits that I have shown here. One is albinism, which is lower left-hand corner. That little boy has no melanin production in his skin, eyes, and hair. And so that makes him lighter in color. His eyes are going to be either very light blue or even reddish, and the hair will have no pigment either. That is a recessive trait that's found in one particular gene. Marfan syndrome is the fellow in the middle. There are well-known basketball players that have been diagnosed with Marfan syndrome. It is a dominant trait in one particular gene. And you can see what it does. It makes you grow very tall, and it makes you have very large hands and feet. And wow, that would come in handy for playing basketball. But there is some bad side effects to Marfan syndrome. For one thing, you just keep growing taller and taller, and you have a lot of problems with your back and your legs, your joints. Also, you can have a weakening of the aorta, and it can split open, which is deadly. So that's Marfan syndrome. And then lower right-hand corner, you see example of cells, red blood cells, sickling out, and this is called sickle cell anemia. This is also a recessive trait that's found in one particular gene. Red blood cells are not supposed to look like those little pointy cells. They're supposed to look like the Werther's lozenges, the little oval-shaped red blood cells, because they fit exactly in capillaries, the tiniest little blood vessels in your tissues. And under low oxygen conditions, if you have sickle cell anemia, your red blood cells can sickle out, like you see some of those pointy red blood cells, and they get stuck in the capillaries. And that means your tissues aren't oxygenated. And from what I understand, it's a terribly painful condition. So that is a recessive trait in one particular gene. All right. I then want to mention epigenetics and what exactly it is. They explain this in the video, but I want to give you a simple illustration of what it is, and here's the on-off switch. Epigenetics is the modification of gene expression when genes are turned on and off in the organism. All right, think about it this way. Every cell in your body has all the genetic information to make you as an organism. So every single cell has all of the instructions to make you an organism. But think about it. A heart muscle cell doesn't look like a skin cell, doesn't look like a liver cell, doesn't look like a lung cell. There's differences in the cells because they have different jobs. Why do they look different? They all have exactly the same DNA because some genes are turned on and some genes are turned off in those cells. That's epigenetics, the control of the genes, when they're turned on, when they're turned off. This is such a hot area of research right now in genetics because we understand a lot about, especially human genes right now, and genes of lots of other species, but even in humans, the thing that we really don't have a handle on yet is how to turn on genes and how to turn them off when we want to. Think about cancer that we just discussed last week. If you could turn off cancer cells from dividing, we could cure cancer, right? Or if somebody has a heart attack and the heart muscle tissue is destroyed because there's been no oxygen, what if we could turn on heart muscle cells and get those to reproduce and fix the damage? What if we could fix damage in spinal cords in people who have been paralyzed because of accidents or injury or disease? Just think of what we could do if we really understood the turning on and off of genes. So no wonder this is a hot area of research. That's epigenetics. The nature versus nurture question has been around for a very long time and has even caused world wars. Because as we understood more and more about genetics, some people thought, well, your whole identity, your whole being is determined by your genes. So if we wipe out undesirable people out of the human population, then their genes won't be carried forward. You get where I'm going with this. This field was called eugenics. And lest you think it was only popular in Germany before World War II and during World War II. No. There was a whole movement in this country. There was sterilization of people who are mentally handicapped, alcoholics, girls who were promiscuous, let us say, that is what they used to call it, to keep their bad genes from being carried forward into the human population in the United States. So people were sterilized against their will for several decades, even in this country. There have been discussions about reparations being made to these people, but how are you going to do that? You just took away their ability to reproduce. So that's the nature side of this. And then you got the nurture side. So how much does the environment play in you as an organism? Does environmental stress cause you to change as a being? How much does your environment influence who you are, what you are as an organism? Good question too. Does trauma affect you? Does trauma affect the future generations? And the answer to that is actually yes, because of epigenetics. A parent can change their epigenetics through trauma, and then that can be passed on to offspring. So these are all very interesting questions. I'm going to post a link to a video of identical twins that were separated at birth, two women, and they found each other after they were grown. And it's very interesting to watch them because they have like mannerisms, and they were not raised together. I will also put a link to a movie from 1956, great year, woohoo, the year I was born. This movie is called The Bad Seed. Okay, it's a little bit cheesy, but it really delves into this issue, nature versus nurture, because of Rhoda, who is a bad little girl, really evil, psychopathic, psychopathic little girl. And so I'll put a trailer in the announcement so that you can take a look at it. And look it up sometime online and watch it. It is a great movie. I love it. This has to do with nature versus nurture. It's brought up several times in the movie. What made Rhoda be this evil? Okay, and then I want to talk about the importance of sexual reproduction. Wow, this picture is so fuzzy. Now, a lot of you will know this family from television. This is the Duggar family. And the reason that I have them on here is because these two parents made all these children, and I doubt if this is the right number from this picture, because don't they have 19 children? The importance of sexual reproduction is that even if the same mother and father get together, the chances of them having two offspring that are exactly alike are 8 million times 8 million. There are 8 million different combinations of your particular chromosomes that end up in your gametes or your sex cells, whether they're eggs or sperm. And so you have 8 million different combinations, your partner has 8 million combinations, and you multiply those two numbers together to get the chance that they would have two offspring that are exactly genetically alike. And that's why you see this variation in their children, even though it's the same two parents. So the odds of having offspring that are genetically alike are just astronomical. Why is this important? Because the genes are all mixed up in the offspring so that every offspring has some particular trait that would help them in some particular environmental stressor situation. And I don't just mean by their looks, okay? So their looks are different, yes, but that also indicates that their biochemistry is different. And what do I mean by that? Your immune system function, how it works, what kind of diseases you're susceptible to. Anything like that, your temperament, your ability to think through problems, all of that is different in all of the offspring. Of course, I'm talking about human beings. Lower animals don't reason through, but anyway, so there's diversity in the offspring. There comes that term again. How does this express itself in organisms? So my sister and I are a lot alike. We both love nature photography, going out looking at nature. We're only 2.5 years apart. We had the same upbringing, all that. But our biochemistry is very different. It's interesting. So we both like foods like tacos and burritos and stuff like that. Well, my sister cannot stand cilantro. To her, it tastes like soap. I love cilantro. It does not taste like soap to me. She also cannot use the sweetener sucralose because to her, it tastes like bleach, tastes like chlorine. If you look at the molecule, it has chlorine ions attached to the molecule. So for her, her biochemistry breaks down that sucralose and releases the chlorine ions, and she tastes that. For me, I like sucralose. I don't have any problem with it. So you see, our biochemistry is different, even though we have exactly the same parents, and we have a lot in common. We don't have those two things in common. So see, your biochemistry can be different. All right, and then finally, biodiversity. I like this picture. I forgot where I got it from, which shows you all the different species that are found in different ecosystems. And so you're going to discuss that this week and why it is important. What happens when you don't have biodiversity? So, for example, in the cheetah population across the planet, there is not much genetic diversity in that species. And there is a great fear that some particular disease is going to come along and wipe out the cheetah population because there just isn't any diversity in their genes. So this is really important. There has to be differences in offspring in order to survive some kind of stressor out there in the world. So you're going to be discussing that this week. Okay, now this was kind of a long video because, of course, I love all this genetic stuff. If you need any help this week, I'm just an email message away, Dr. Sigmon, m.sigmon@snhu.edu. Let me know if you need anything, please, okay? And I hope that you have a wonderful week this week.